For 40 years, I stood where I was told to stand, believed what I was told to believe, and silenced questions that kept knocking on my soul. 40 years of faith, discipline, loyalty, yet deep inside, something felt unfinished. I did everything right, followed every rule, trusted every promise, and still peace felt conditional, not real. One day I realized something powerful. Strength is not only about holding on, it's also about knowing when to let go. This is not a story of anger or rebellion. This is a story of courage. The courage to think for myself. The courage to listen to my conscience instead of my fear. The courage to walk away from what no longer made me stronger. Today, I don't speak to attack belief, I speak to honor truth. Because real growth begins the moment you stop living someone else's answers and start living your own life. For 40 years, faith shaped the rhythm of my life. It decided how I woke up, how I spoke, how I judged myself, and how I measured my worth. It was not just something I believed in, it was something I lived inside. I was loyal, committed, disciplined. I prayed when I was strong, and prayed even harder when I was afraid. I trusted that obedience would bring peace, that sacrifice would bring clarity, that silence would bring wisdom. And for a long time, I told myself it was working, because that is what you do when belief becomes identity. You don't question it, you protect it. I grew up learning that doubt was dangerous. Questions were weaknesses. Curiosity had limits. I learned how to smile through confusion, how to explain away discomfort, how to call fear faith. I learned how to ignore the quiet voice inside me that kept asking why. Why does love feel conditional? Why does truth feel fragile? Why does growth feel like guilt? Every time those questions surfaced, I pushed them down because I believed strength meant certainty. And certainty meant never looking too closely at what didn't make sense. But life has a way of testing what you claim to believe. Pain arrived without permission. Loss didn't ask whether I was faithful enough. Reality didn't bend just because I prayed harder. I began to notice that the answers I repeated no longer comforted me. They sounded rehearsed, not real. I wasn't losing faith in something outside of me. I was losing faith in the version of myself that wasn't allowed to think. And that realization shook me more than any doubt ever could. Questioning did not happen overnight. It was slow, uncomfortable, lonely. It started with small moments. Reading something that didn't fit, hearing a story that didn't align, watching kind people live meaningful lives outside the boundaries I was taught were absolute. Each moment added weight. Not enough to break me, but enough to make me stop pretending everything was solid. I realized I had spent decades defending beliefs I was afraid to examine, not because they were true, but because they were familiar. The hardest part was not questioning the belief system. The hardest part was questioning who I would be without it. When something defines you for 40 years, letting yourself examine it feels like erasing your past. I feared disappointing people. I feared being misunderstood. I feared losing community, identity, and purpose. But deeper than all of that was a more honest fear. The fear that if I allowed myself to question, I might actually grow. And growth meant responsibility. Growth meant standing alone. Growth meant owning my life fully. As I questioned, something unexpected happened. I didn't become empty. I became aware. I started listening instead of repeating. I started observing instead of assuming. I allowed myself to say I don't know. And for the first time, that felt powerful. I discovered that integrity is not about defending a position at all costs. It's about being honest with yourself, even when the truth is inconvenient. I learned that courage is not loud. It's quiet. It shows up when you choose authenticity over approval. My journey of faith taught me discipline, resilience, and commitment. I don't reject those lessons. I carry them with me. But I also learned that loyalty without reflection can turn into fear, and devotion without questioning can turn into self-betrayal. There came a moment when staying felt more dishonest than leaving. Not because I hated what I believed, but because I loved truth more than comfort. And that choice changed me. Walking away was not freedom at first. It was grief. It was unlearning. It was standing in uncertainty without a script. But in that space, I discovered something real. My values didn't disappear. My compassion didn't vanish. My sense of meaning didn't collapse. Instead, they became mine, chosen, not inherited, lived, not enforced. I realized that morality rooted in fear is fragile, but morality rooted in understanding is strong. Questioning my faith did not make me weaker. It demanded strength I didn't know I had. It required me to stand without guarantees, to trust my conscience, to accept that life doesn't always offer simple answers. But it also gave me something belief alone never did. It gave me ownership of my mind. I stopped outsourcing my truth. I stopped apologizing for thinking. I stopped shrinking to fit someone else's certainty. This journey taught me that growth often looks like loss before it feels like gain. That courage is not about attacking what you leave behind, but about respecting yourself enough to move forward honestly. I didn't leave because I was broken. I left because I was becoming whole. I left because my inner voice finally became louder than my fear. I left because a life lived on autopilot is not a life lived at all. After 40 years, I learned that faith should never require you to abandon yourself. That truth should not fear examination. That meaning is not handed to you fully formed. It is built through awareness, responsibility, and courage. Questioning didn't destroy my life. It expanded it. It taught me that the bravest thing a person can do is stand still long enough to ask whether the path they're on is truly theirs, and then choose to walk forward. There came a moment in my life when belief stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like noise. For years I had been told that peace would come if I believed harder, prayed longer, obeyed more completely. So I did. I doubled down. I corrected myself before questioning anything. I disciplined my thoughts, filtered my emotions, and learned how to smile even when my spirit felt restless. On the outside, I looked grounded. On the inside, I felt increasingly disconnected from myself. Peace was promised, but what I felt was pressure. At first, I blamed myself. I assumed something was wrong with me. Maybe I wasn't faithful enough. Maybe I didn't surrender enough. Maybe I was secretly flawed. That mindset kept me trapped longer than I cared to admit. When belief no longer brought peace, I was taught that the solution was not to listen inward, but to silence myself further. And for a long time, I believed. That was strength. I confused endurance with wisdom and suppression with maturity. But the body and the mind don't lie forever. The quiet discomfort turned into exhaustion. The certainty I repeated stopped landing in my heart. I noticed that my calm was performative, not real. I wasn't resting in peace, I was managing anxiety. I wasn't grounded, I was bracing myself. That's when I realized something important. Peace doesn't need defending. It doesn't require explanation. It doesn't punish curiosity. Real peace feels expansive, not restrictive. Listening to my inner truth was not dramatic or sudden. It was subtle. It showed up in moments when I felt relief instead of guilt after admitting I didn't know. It appeared when I allowed myself to sit with questions instead of rushing to answers. My inner voice didn't shout. It didn't attack belief. It simply asked for honesty. And honesty, I learned, is uncomfortable for it is freeing. The hardest part was accepting that the discomfort I felt wasn't a failure of faith, but a signal of growth. I had outgrown a framework that once served me. That doesn't make the framework evil, and it doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. Growth changes what we need. What once felt like guidance can later feel like confinement. When belief stopped bringing peace, my inner truth wasn't telling me to burn everything down. It was asking me to stop pretending. Listening inward required me to slow down, to sit alone without rehearsed answers, to admit fear without labeling it sin, to trust my conscience even when it contradicted what I was taught. That was terrifying, because when you stop outsourcing your peace to a belief system, you take responsibility for your life. You can no longer hide behind certainty. You have to choose. And choice is heavy when you've spent decades being told what to think. As I listen more closely, I note, that my values remained intact. Compassion didn't disappear. Kindness didn't weaken. Integrity didn't collapse. If anything, they became clear. I realized that my inner truth was not reckless or rebellious. It was grounded. It wanted alignment, not chaos. It wanted meaning that felt lived, not memorized. It wanted peace that came from understanding, not fear of being wrong. There's a difference between peace that comes from silence and peace that comes from authenticity. Silence can feel calm, but it's fragile. It depends on control. Authentic peace is steady. It allows doubt, emotion, and complexity without collapsing. When belief no longer brought peace, I had to ask myself a difficult question. Am I calm because I am at peace, or because I am afraid to look deeper? That question changed everything. Listening to my inner truth meant disappointing people. It meant being misunderstood. It meant letting go of certainty in exchange for clarity. There were days when I wished I could go back to not knowing what I now knew. Ignorance can feel safe. But once awareness arrives, pretending becomes painful. And I learned that ignoring your inner truth doesn't make it go away. It only makes it louder in more destructive ways. As I honored that inner voice, something unexpected happened. I became more present, more grounded, less reactive. I stopped arguing to prove I was right and started listening to understand. My sense of purpose shifted from defending beliefs to living values. I realized that peace is not something you earn by obedience, it's something you experience when your inner life and outer life align. This journey taught me that belief should support your humanity, not override it. That any system that demands you abandon your inner compass eventually costs you your sense of self. Listening to my inner truth didn't make me arrogant, it made me accountable. I could no longer blame doctrine for my choices or hide behind tradition. I had to own my actions, my ethics, my growths. When belief no longer brought peace, it wasn't the end of meaning in my life, it was the beginning of honesty. I learned that inner truth is not about having all the answers, it's about being willing to live the questions with integrity. It's about choosing awareness over comfort, responsibility over reassurance, growth over approval. Peace returned, but it was different, quieter, stronger. It didn't depend on being right. It didn't fear uncertainty. It came from trusting myself to navigate life with compassion and reason. It came from knowing that I was no longer at war with my own mind. Listening to my inner truth didn't take faith away from me. It transformed it into something personal, grounded and real. Something that didn't ask me to disappear to belong. Something that finally allowed me to breathe without permission. Something that felt like coming home to myself. For a long time I believed that leaving meant rejecting everything I had been taught, that walking away would define me as angry, broken or lost. I was told that departure equals rebellion, that questioning equals pride, that growth only happens inside approved boundaries. So when I finally stepped away after decades of commitment, I had to confront not only my own fears but the labels others were ready to place on me. What I discovered surprised me. Leaving was not an act of defiance, it was an act of maturity. It was not about destroying faith. It was about developing myself. Rebellion is loud. It seeks reaction. It feeds on opposition. What I experienced was quiet, heavy, and deeply personal. It came after years of reflection, not a moment of anger. It came from responsibility, not impulse. I did not leave to prove a point. I left because I had reached a stage in my life, Here, honesty mattered more than approval. Growth has a way of asking difficult questions, and ignoring them would have meant betraying the person I was becoming. For most of my life, Christianity gave me structure. It taught me discipline, community, and purpose. I don't deny that. But personal growth does not stop at gratitude. Growth asks whether what once helped you still allows you to breathe freely. At some point, I realized that I was maintaining an identity that no longer fit my inner reality. Staying would have been easier socially, but harder spiritually and emotionally. Leaving was not comfortable. It was necessary. Personal growth often looks like loss before it feels like expansion. When you step away from something that shaped you for years, you don't just lose beliefs. You lose routines, language, belonging, and certainty. That kind of loss forces you to confront yourself without shortcuts. There is no doctrine to hide behind. No script to repeat. You must stand on your own values and accept full responsibility for how you live. That is not rebellion, that is adulthood. I had to unlearn the idea that morality only exists within one system. I discovered that compassion does not disappear when belief changes. Kindness does not require permission. Integrity does not collapse outside a label. In fact, my ethics became stronger when they were chosen consciously instead of inherited automatically. Growth taught me that doing good out of understanding is more powerful than doing good out of fear. Leaving also forced me to face fear honestly, fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear of disappointing people I love, fear of being wrong. But growth doesn't eliminate fear. It teaches you to walk through it with clarity. I learned that courage is not about certainty. It is about alignment. It is about living in a way that matches your conscience, EV. And when it costs you comfort. One of the biggest myths I had to dismantle was the idea that questioning equals arrogance. In reality, questioning requires humility. It requires admitting that you might not have all the answers. It requires listening instead of defending. When I stopped trying to protect an identity and started trying to understand myself, I felt lighter, not because everything made sense, but because I was no longer pretending that it did. Leaving Christianity was not a rejection of spirituality, it was a redefinition of it. I stopped outsourcing meaning and started building it through lived experience, through empathy, through reflection, through responsibility. My relationship with life became more direct. I no longer filtered every experience through a pre-approved explanation. I allowed complexity. And complexity, I learned, is not the enemy of peace. Denial is. Growth also taught me respect. Respect for those who remain. Respect for my past self. Respect for the journey itself. I don't see my earlier faith as a mistake. I see it as a chapter. But no chapter lasts forever if the story is moving forward. Staying out of loyalty to the past can prevent you from becoming who you are meant to be in the present. Growth demands movement. There is a quiet strength that comes from standing without a safety net, from saying I don't know and being okay with that, from building your life based on reflection rather than repetition. That strength did not come from rebelling against belief. It came from growing beyond dependency. I learned to trust my reasoning, my empathy, and my ability to learn from mistakes. Personal growth also sharpened my compassion. When I stopped dividing the world into right and wrong camps, I started seeing people more clearly. I listened more, I judged less. I understood that everyone is navigating their own fears and hopes. Grow. TH widened my perspective instead of narrowing it. It made me more human, not less. Leaving was not about proving belief wrong. It was about proving myself honest. Honest with my doubts, honest with my values, honest with my limits. That honesty changed how I show up in the world. I no longer perform certainty. I practice integrity. I no longer defend positions. I live principles. If rebellion is about destruction, then growth is about construction. I didn't burn bridges to feel powerful. I built a foundation that could hold my weight. One that allows me to stand with dignity, curiosity, and accountability. Growth required me to let go of borrowed certainty and develop earned clarity. In the end, living Christianity was not the end of meaning in my life. It was the beginning of ownership. Ownership of my thoughts, ownership of my ethics, ownership of my future. Growth does not always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like quietly choosing truth over tradition, authenticity over approval, and self-respect over familiarity. Even when no one applauds, even when the path is unclear, even when the only reward is the peace that comes from living in alignment with who you truly are. Today, I stand at peace not because I have all the answers, but because I finally stopped lying to myself. I no longer measure my worth by obedience or silence, but by honesty and awareness. Leaving did not strip me of meaning, it forced me to create it with intention. I learned that growth is not about replacing one certainty with another, but about learning how to live with clarity, humility, and responsibility. I learned that strength is not found in holding on at all costs, but in knowing when holding on is costing you your truth. This journey taught me that life does not reward imitation, it rewards alignment. When your inner voice and outer life finally match, something settles inside you. You stop performing, you stop proving, you start living. I didn't lose myself when I left. I found myself beneath the layers of fear, expectation, and inherited belief. I discovered that authenticity is quieter than doctrine, but far more powerful. If there is one thing this path has given me, it is this understanding. Growth will always offend comfort, truth will always challenge tradition, and freedom will always require courage. But nothing compares to the peace that comes when you finally choose to live as who you are, not who you were told to be, and walk forward with integrity, awareness, and the confidence that your life now belongs fully to you.